Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Welcome, Pacesetters of Agribusiness, to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod. I'm your host, Joe Mosier. Thanks for tuning in today. You know, it is remarkable how dynamic, uncertain, and volatile the market conditions are for soybeans this time, and frankly, for oilseeds more generally. Seed oils are in the news related to human health, renewable fuels, impacts on the prospects for exports as one of the country's largest agricultural products. You know, the list just goes on and on. And because seed oils and soybeans are in the news, I think it's important that we talk about them on this program as it relates to what it means for you, a leader in agribusiness. Whether you're selling soybean seeds, whether you're doing field applications in an ag retail environment, whether you're originating the soybeans, trading them, crushing them, whatever it is, this is a very relevant topic for all of us. The challenge, of course, is that while this is a weekly podcast, which should ostensibly allow us to have a really current conversation on current sets of facts in the news, there's usually several weeks between when we record an episode and when it eventually is released. You know, time for production and getting it cleaned up and eventually getting it into the queue. And during that time, especially now, conditions on the field can change. Nevertheless, we have had, soybean handlers and processors on this show before, and I wanted to now talk with an industry and commodity advocate, a commodity association, to understand better the macro production, supply, demand, and consumption factors that are driving all the headline news. Really get past what we're seeing in the media and the clips on social media, et cetera, and really understand, let's break it down to its base level of facts and build back up to what kind of conclusions or observations we can draw. And I want to do this even if it means we risk recording an episode that might prove to have a relatively short shelf life in terms of how applicable it is in these fast-changing times by the time we release it. And so today, it's my pleasure to share an interview I did recently with Ryan Locke. Ryan's the Vice President of Engagement for the National Oilseed Processors Association, or NOPA, as it's more commonly referred to. Now, if you don't know NOPA, they were organized in 1930, and they represent the U.S. soybean, canola, flaxseed, safflower, and sunflower seed crushing industries. Their membership is engaged in the processing of oilseeds for meal and oil that are all utilized in the manufacturing of food, feed, and renewable fuels and a variety of other industrial products. NOPA's roughly 18 member companies operate over 70 different soft seed and soybean solvent extraction plants across 21 states in the country, and they crush roughly 95% of all soybeans processed in the United States, which is the equivalent to more than 2 billion bushels annually. Now, in this interview, Ryan's going to walk us through everything the oilseed industry is facing right now, from the science versus sentiment arguments around seed oils and our food, to the renewable volume obligations and how that's evolving, 45Z and tax incentives, the policy attempts to find equilibrium in supply and demand when it comes to soybeans, and ultimately what all the trade friction we're working through now means for trade prospects and opportunities out into the future. Really great conversation. I'm hoping it holds up the test of time in this fast-changing environment. And so without further ado, here's my conversation with Ryan Locke of the National Oilseed Processors Association. Ryan, thanks for finding a time to join us from the road in your busy travel schedule, and welcome to the Pacesetter Pod.
Joe, thanks. I appreciate having the chance to be on.
Yeah, we got a lot of stuff to cover today, and we're joking here before we hit record about the ever-shortening shelf life of observations around trade and policy stance and, the current, what do we know to be currently true when it comes to oil seeds and the grain markets and et cetera. And so we're going to have a great discussion today. I'm excited for it. And we're going to do our very best to turn this around and get it back out to the audience as soon as possible, because again, we don't know what the shelf life of some of the stuff we might talk about would be. But one of the things that is true, both now and well into the future, is that the National Oilseed Processors Association plays a really important role for the industry, for oilseed growers, for the folks that are, of course, are processing oilseeds into the multiple different forms for use that they have, as well as for the end use markets that consume that product. But for folks that maybe don't know what NOPA is or are less familiar, can you maybe give us the NOPA 101, what you all do, and in particular, what you all do that might not happen in the absence of an organization such as yours?
I'd be happy to, Joe. National Oilseed Processors Association's legacy is approaching 100 years, and we are the advocacy, representation, and education arm of the oilseed processing industry for soybeans, canola, flaxseed, safflower, and sunflower. So our members are responsible for 95% of the processing that happens here in the United States. And within NOPA, we're basically out there making sure that that perspective is at the table. At the end of the day, there's a lot of aspects of agriculture that plug into oilseed processing, but the thought leadership really rests with NOPA and our members. And it's important to have that thought leadership at the table when you're trying to craft policy, craft regulation. Having access to the individuals that do this every day and understand the implications of that is critical.
And when you talk about members, are these agribusinesses? Are these retail brands? I mean, give us a general idea of what's the profile of a NOPA member.
So a NOPA member is going to be an entity that is actively in the business of processing and crushing oil seeds. So, think of the ABCD companies, and you'd have a significant portion of our membership.
Okay. And talking about the role you all play in helping to advocate for the value, the message, the perceptions of the oilseed processing industry, was that created in response to lack of advocacy for oilseeds or the oilseed complex being under threat? And the reason I'm asking is I'm thinking about in this moment, the state of seed oils is such that seed oils are having a moment, and perhaps not the moment that they'd always like to be having. But if we go back to that 100 years ago, was there a particular triggering event that brought NOPA into existence? Or was it following that general secular trend of all the major commodity groups and industrial groups sort of creating these associations to help tell their story to the folks that, can guide policy and capital, et cetera, to build out the complex?
It really rests more in the latter. It wasn't necessarily a defining, triggering event, where it was, we have to respond to this. It really was as the association space continued to grow. A lot of, the major associations, can date their history back to the early to mid 30s, and in some cases even further back, because again, it's the representation. It is having that seat at the table. It is the acknowledged thought leadership that the member companies back then and now did not feel was being represented in the conversations that were ultimately impacting, their business.
Yeah. Well, and as I sort of alluded to there a moment ago, I mean, this is sort of the perfect moment for soybeans and oilseeds writ large to have an advocacy organization like NOPA because of the messaging, the public perception, some of the sort of legislative instruments that are being considered relative to oilseeds. And so maybe talk to us about what is the state of seed oils today. And we're recording this here in the back half of May 2025. But, how would you summarize where seed oils are at today in the context of MAHA or Make America Healthy Again, science versus sentiment? For a long time, it seemed like it was settled science that seed oils were actually a heart-healthy source of energy for human consumption. And maybe that's now being challenged. Just generally, what would you say is where are you at today? What are you guys all focusing on in terms of telling seed oil's story?
I would concur that it is an evolving landscape, and particularly as we have moved closer to the release of the MAHA Commission's report, it's almost a daily evolution of telling that story. And we have been telling that story both to the consumer, amongst our members, with our representatives on Capitol Hill. We did think it was settled science. Everyone remembers 30, 40 years ago, and saturated versus unsaturated fats, and the move from things like beef tallow and lard to seed oils because of their health benefits. And all of that was extensively studied, and we had settled that this was the path forward for proper nutrition. So we're always open to reevaluating and having new conversations around, how we make America healthy again, so to speak. However, It's not really being driven by the science. It's really being driven more by the sentiment of, someone who feels a choice that they've made, which they're free to make, is ultimately a choice that they should also be able to make for someone else. And that's when it kind of goes off the rails.
And so, sometimes it's hard to cut through to the actual underlying messages. And like you just said, is this science or sentiment? And I can't claim to have been spending too close of attention to this particular topic. But as I prepared for an interview and watch what's happening right now, and I think there's even been some emerging news here this morning around the MAHA Commission report. What is the criticism being levied against seed oils? Is it that it is a direct causal driver of cardiovascular disease? Is it contributing to type 2 diabetes? Is there specific causal relationships to poor health outcomes that are being drawn? Or is it more of a general blunt instrument against seed oils in general, absent these sort of examples?
I'll come from it from two directions, Joe. The first is kind of ultimately a misrepresentation, because you hear the term ultra-processed foods, and there's a false parallel because in a lot of ultra-processed foods, there are seed oils, but seed oils do not make an ultra-processed food. And so you have that kind of false affirmative that people are drawing between seed oils and overall healthy, quote unquote, versus unhealthy foods. And then there are some studies that align with seed oils causing various types of inflammation in the body, but those aren't very well followed studies, very well supported studies. And most of the scientific basis, the scientific studies that are out there say that's not the case, that seed oil consumption does not directly tie back into those inflammations. So it really is certain sectors singling out some of these components that are in our food system as the villain. In fact, there's a quote from a couple of weeks ago that even used the word poison, which I think is a very strong word to lay upon seed oils. But at the end of the day, it couldn't be further from the truth. And we have a significant amount of research and a significant amount of time that seed oils have been in our food supply that really says the exact opposite.
Mm. Yeah, I just think about it over the course of my career. I remember when we first started talking about removing saturated fats or removing the particularly unhealthy fats from French fries, for example, and moving to trans fat-free cooking oils, and that sort of being a transformative technology and seen as a big particular gain. That was very much in vogue for a while, and I could be wrong here, but I believe that the move off of trans fat-free or move towards trans fat-free cooking oils also heavily leveraged palm as one of the inclusions. And then over time, palm has fallen out of favor, somewhat for health benefit reasons, health benefit concerns, but also because of environmental degradation and deforestation concerns in sensitive parts of the world where palm is produced, in Southeast Asia, for example. And so these things do feel somewhat cyclical in nature, and science does evolve. So I guess from my standpoint, I'm always open to the idea that, okay, we thought butter was bad. We started eating margarine. Now we sort of have learned more that perhaps margarine is not as healthy as we thought. Let's revert back to butter. But it does need to be backed up by rigorous, peer-reviewed, provable, repeatable science. And if I'm hearing you correctly, we might not be yet at that point of having that provable, repeatable sort of time-tested science to justify some of the criticisms that are coming down about the seed oils complex generally.
We don't. We just don't have a significant body of knowledge opposing what has already been established about seed oils. And, the research has continued. We didn't stop. The American diet and the global diet, it continues to be studied. And we call them single focus activists that have decided to, again, single out just this component of the food system and point it out as the reason for all of our potential woes. It's irresponsible. That's really the best way to ultimately approach it. It's irresponsible. The output or the ultimate causes of any issues that we have with American health or global health, whether that be obesity, whether that be things like diabetes, those are multifaceted issues. And we absolutely need to have a conversation about them for the good of society, for the good of the globe. But we can't finger point. We have to really sit down and have some honest discussions with ourselves as a society of what are the true triggering points that are causing some of these things.
Yeah. And if seed oils is proven to have some sort of a detrimental effect, that needs to be properly weighted against the other sort of, as you said, it's a multifactorial problem, right? You have environmental issues, you have behavioral issues around levels of consumption, levels of physical activity, you have hereditary inputs, you have a variety of things that happen. And so seed oils are ultimately proven to have a negative impact. As you said, you can't isolate all of the ails to one particular input, or at least that'd be incredibly unlikely. Nothing's ever that easy to fix, right? Remove this one thing and health fixes itself. And so I remain open to the idea that the science may evolve. What we know may evolve. But even in a situation where it's proven true, I doubt that it's the lion's share, or certainly not the entirety of the issues. And one of the reasons, Ryan, I wanted to have you on the show, when we talk to and about agribusiness operators, and this show is to help folks think critically and rigorously about their businesses and about how they execute strategy. And I do not want for a moment to suggest that invested capital and returns on that capital are more important than human health, because that's not how I feel. However, should we make drastic changes in what we deem acceptable for human and animal consumption, in this case, seed oils, if you suddenly disqualify that as a healthy, safe, reliable source of calories and nutrition, there's some real big knock-on effects. There's knock-on effects to the American grower, who's invested a lot of capital into their ability to produce soybeans at scale. There's a lot of invested capital and energy around the origination of those beans, the logistics of getting them, conditioning them, storing them, and then ultimately getting them to a processor. And we know the last 5 to 7 years, the build out in the soybean processing complex has been, just incredible. And so we do need to take these sort of these positions around the safety of a product very seriously, because if we levy an indictment that is proven to be untrue or mostly untrue, you do tremendous damage to the industry and to a lot of small and large farmers. So that being said, seed oils are a part of the demand side of the equation for in terms of human consumption. But we use soybeans for a lot of things, right? Meal goes into animals. Oils also go into biofuels, et cetera. And so I don't really think we can talk about, have a good discussion of the risks and prospects of soybean production and processing in North America if we don't talk about like the renewable volume obligations or 45Z. And so we can come back in a moment and define those terms, or you can define them for us if you like. But what is, as we record this here on May 20th, what is the state of soybeans and processing in terms of renewable fuels and biofuels, RVO and 45Z? What would you say on that side, sort of shifting gears?
So, ultimately, renewable volume obligations, or RVOs, and 45Z are kind of all tied into the renewable fuel standard. And as we sit here, we're hopefully days away from the new guidance on RVO, renewable volume obligations. And, as we've talked about American energy dominance, as we've talked about renewables, as we've talked about how we satisfy the global need, for energy, that's always been part of that conversation. And, the last time that those obligations got set, they got set significantly under the capacity of the industry, with the belief, that we would kind of meet or grow those obligations. And that demand signal triggered a lot of investment in ethanol plants, in soybean crush facilities, and other seed oil crush facilities. And we didn't get there. And so we have a fresh opportunity now. And again, we're mere days, hopefully, from that announcement to set ourselves up for success, to set the industry up for success, to set growers up for success by having a demand signal for seed oils within renewable fuels that says there's going to be a demand for this commodity. There's going to be a use for this commodity. It aligns with the aspirations of the administration. It aligns with the aspirations of the economy. So hopefully we land this right. It's critically important that we land this right.
Yeah, and what a week, right? Between the MAHA Commission report and then now the RFS renewal guidance coming out. I'm again grateful that you took time to talk to us today, because I know you've got a lot on your plate. But so I want to talk about this more, but let's take a pause here, and I do want to let's define these terms. And they all fall under the RFS, or Renewable Fuel Standards. But RVO, as Ryan just said, stands for the Renewable Volume Obligation. And the Renewable Volume Obligation is a policy that mandates biofuel producers to blend a specified amount of renewable fuel into liquid fuels, both gasoline and diesel, that's to be sold into the United States. Ryan is nodding. You guys can't see it, so that must be a correct definition. On the other side, 45Z, which we've talked about on this show before, I'm sure everyone listening is generally familiar with, but it's really part of the Clean Fuels Production Tax Credit, which is a federal tax credit that is meant to incentivize the production of clean transportation fuels, again, to be sold into the United States. When it comes to 45Z, we've got some new guidance that I was reading a report from CoBank this week that one of the problems with 45Z has been what qualified as an acceptable feedstock or feedstock source into that, and does that favor, because it was a federal tax credit for in the American tax system, but was it benefiting American farmers, or was it supporting the importation of cheaper feedstocks and inputs from overseas? And so what I read this week in a report from CoBank is that the 45Z has been extended through the end of 2031, and that it limits feedstock eligibility to feedstocks that are produced in North America, so the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. It really looks to then exclude or drastically limit the use of Chinese UCO, or used cooking oil, or conversely, Brazilian beef tallow into was an acceptable feedstock. So it's a major change and a welcomed exclusion on the behalf of the American farmer. So is that what you're seeing also on the 45Z side, Ryan, or what else would you add to that in terms of where that stands at this time?
So all of our conversations show things moving in the same direction as it pertains to the overall landing of the tax policy. It really boils down to this is a tax credit that's using American tax dollars, and shouldn't it ultimately be used to buoy American production? And in this case, that would, of course, be, seed oil production and support American farmers. You use the word exclude, and exclude is a little bit strong. There's no provisions in there that block the use of those other feedstocks ultimately from being used. But what it does is ultimately level the playing field, that a incentive that is being paid for with domestic dollars isn't ultimately incentivizing that to be invested in other places, in non-domestic feedstock to drive this industry. It's not rocket science that if we're trying to bolster U.S. demand for biofuels with a tax credit and a tax policy like this, that it ultimately should stay domestic as far as how it's ultimately applied.
Yeah, certainly. It's almost like value leakage. If you create a tax structure, an incentive structure whereby it should encourage domestic production of certain feedstocks, but there's the opportunity to redirect that tax incentive to the importation of feedstocks overseas. It's effectively a value leakage relative to the objectives of the tax structure. And yeah, so when I meant exclusion, it was meant to, it excludes from the incentive those other ingredients, but yeah, clearly wouldn't bar them from being used. I don't have any numbers here in front of me, but I know one of the things I've read and heard a lot about is some of the slowdown of maybe planned construction of additional crush capacity in the U.S., maybe reduced operations, not necessarily idled capacity, but we've had this big planned build out, and then it was sort of a softening effect when the uncertainty around 45Z late last year and into the early part of this year happened, where folks were saying, we're just going to slow our grind, slow our processing. There's less forward purchasing because that uncertainty made it hard for people to know would they be able to hit their profitability and margin targets. Would you expect with these signals that we're going to have more clarity, whether folks like it or not, there'll be more clarity around what 45Z is going to mean operationally in the market? Would you expect a resumption of additional capacity being brought online, existing capacity being run closer to full capacity? Sort of what are you hearing in terms of the processing side of the business, of the industry?
So even just on the rumors, Joe, of RVOs landing in that 5.25 billion gallon range, we've seen soybean prices buoyed just on the possibility, and that trickles through. So that's the demand signal that producers need to plant. Landing correctly on the tax policy will allow for those that are actively crushing oilseeds and refining biofuels to know, again, that they have to meet those obligations, and thus bring some of these plants back up to full capacity. To fill in the blanks on some of the numbers that you're looking for, ultimately the industry invested about $6 billion and increased capacity 30%, and then didn't see that demand signal, didn't see that ask for that level of production ultimately realized. And plants have shuttered, plants have closed, plants have idled. Plants are running significantly below capacity, and the margins are extremely tight. There's been 2 closures here just in the past couple of weeks, as we've again waited for some definitive signal that we are moving in a direction that is ultimately more supportive of oilseed crush. So we are actively looking to see these signals kind of come full circle and be realized, because we know that even, again, based on just the possibility, just the rumor that this demand signal is going to be initiated for the market's responded positively.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
Yeah, so thanks for filling in those gaps where there actually have been some idling and shutdowns and shuttering of plants. Perhaps the only thing harder than shutting down a crush facility is resuming operations, right? These are not flip of the switch type operations. And just to sort of pressure test or stress test the observation that we've seen idled capacity in response to lack of demand signals, there are times in business where an existing business or existing operation may be pre-existing stress, maybe unable to meet efficiency goals, quality goals, not able to create the demand relationships they need, logistically challenged, et cetera, such that the business is under pressure, and that a macro level policy change can be welcome covering fire and used as a headline for why we're going to idle a plant. And I'm not pointing fingers at any particular company here, but as you look at the plants that have slowed down or have actually shuttered and stopped operations, do you observe at any time that maybe these are the older facilities that arguably are maybe going to be sunset and then replaced with the new capacity coming online? Or is it widely distributed, both new and old capacity, et cetera? I'm just trying to cut through how much of it is actually a causal relationship from lack of uncertainty to, well, hell, if we have to shut this thing down, now's a great time to do it because we got a really good story to tell about why we can't run this facility anymore.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, Joe, and I think ultimately you have to look at it from both sides. I think that there's absolutely some evolution that any industry goes through as processes improve, as, again, you innovate within an industry. But what we do know is that, even if we align with the argument that plants are being idled because they're obsolete. We also have seen planned groundbreakings pushed out, planned groundbreakings canceled, because again, those demand signals are not there. And even with those older plants, if you have a business model, from a margin capture, standpoint that continues to make those operations make sense, it's really only when, things get absolutely untenable that, businesses make that decision. So if we were in a scenario of healthier margins and a known demand for biofuels and a positive RVO environment, we probably wouldn't lose those plants and we wouldn't lose those jobs in the rural communities because the economics would still make sense, even in those cases. But when the economics stop making sense, then businesses do have to make hard choices sometimes. But they've also made the hard choices of not making those future investments in new facilities that do have, those more streamlined and perhaps profitable, operations.
Yeah, that's fair. I appreciate you leaning into the question, and again, I'm not pointing any particular fingers, any particular anything, but I think it's something that I know that happens over breakfast in the hotels during business trips, and sometimes happens in the quiet corners of conversations at conferences where folks speculate around the headline justification for a business decision versus what they might have heard otherwise. But I think it's a fair point that even if a business or even if a plant is tipping into obsolescence, maybe it's age, it's dated, it hasn't been properly maintained, it's just poorly configured for the type of operation that they need today, whatever that might be, clear demand signals in the marketplace might provide the tailwinds to allow a gradual retrofitting, a gradual reinvestment, or some sort of a marginal value add operation of that asset in some ways. And so both could be frankly true, I think, is part of the through line here. Let's get into the numbers of the RVO. And I want you to walk us through this here, but I'll tell you first what I understand to be the case, and then you can walk me through and walk the listeners through where I got it wrong here, Ryan. But as I understand it, the prior administration, the Biden administration, had an ask for the renewable volume obligation of 5.25 billion gallons, or is it bushels? I don't have my denominator here, in the new RVO. That was their ask, was 5.25. And that's gallons. Excuse me, that's gallons. But that North American capacity was already at roughly 5.3 billion gallons, meaning that new ask would have already left excess capacity of around 500 million gallons of domestic feedstock remaining on the marketplace. Over the last several weeks, I've read reports from everything as low as 3.2 or 3.5, somewhere in that range, being the new RVO, which was very bearish soybeans because that's taking a significant amount of demand out of the marketplace. We've seen it at 4.5, and I think what you said here early this morning was that the new signal something closer to 5.2. 5.2 billion gallons in RVO relative to at least the ability to produce 5.3 billion gallons, so leaving a significant amount of feedstock in the marketplace. Are those the right numbers? And if so, what do you expect to be the impact of a 5.2? Is that bullish because of the relief effect? That's not worse, or is it going to be bearish because it's still short of where the prior administration was hoping to see things land?
So to go back to your opener, it's actually a little bit more significant than you lay out. The previous RVO level was actually closer to 3.6 billion gallons of renewable and D4, which is renewable diesel. And that was when the capacity was building its way towards that 5.3 billion gallons. And we've now reached that level because those plans that were announced have come online. Efficiencies have been captured. And so, again, the capacity within the industry here domestically provides for the ability to meet at least 5.3 billion gallons. And so the conversations that we are having today with legislature on the Hill, and amongst others, is for that RVO number to sit closer to that 5.25 billion gallon number to meet the domestic capacity that exists. We don't want to create a scenario where we're not, where we end up upside down, because again, those renewable volume obligations are law. So we don't want to set ourselves up for failure. But what we do want to do is make sure that we are aligning those RVOs as close to the actual available capacity that exists, while also leaving space for some of those other feedstocks that we've already mentioned as we've chatted. So at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is have the administration align with what the capacity of the business is to supply this market, and that's well in excess. We can go further, and as the conversations continue, we want to go further, both in support of our members and support of the farm economy beyond 5.25. But the system can absolutely absorb 5.25 billion gallons as it pertains to demand for renewable and biodiesel blends.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you for correcting the numbers there. I clearly had some of those figures wrong. And when you say you don't want to get underwater, meaning we don't want to set a 5.5 RVO where we don't believe that the industry has capacity to meet that, because then immediately you'd start having to import, effectively the RVO would be benefiting foreign markets, et cetera, through the importation of other feedstocks just to meet something, to backfill where American agriculture is not yet at a point to be able to serve that.
Yeah, you create an artificial demand signal.
Okay. So, artificial demand signal. That wasn't a planned transition here, but I'm gonna jump on it. You talked about we want the administration to create an RVO that is reflective of the capacity that exists in the marketplace. That's not exactly how you put it, but that's clearly part of the efforts, is to have an RVO that is reflective of capacity, such that we do create the demand signal for the production, the growing, the planting, the growing, the harvesting, and then the processing of soybeans and seed oils into renewable fuels. But you could argue that creating an RVO is into itself an artificial demand signal, because it doesn't exist in the absence of this legislative or regulatory action, the law, as you put it. So are we trying to solve a supply issue, meaning we've gotten so good at production ag, broad acre agriculture, at planting beans, maximizing yields, minimizing loss at harvest, minimizing shrink in storage and transportation, such that we are overproducing our needs, and we now need something like the RVO and 45Z to ensure that we can continue to support this build out of agricultural production efficiency in the marketplace. I'd love your take on that, because we've talked about this with other guests as well, of agriculture is ultimately a very complex game of supply and demand, and playing the S&Ds is kind of how you win. And it says it's hard to parse out what is an authentic, market-driven, agnostic of policy instruments or governmental intervention. What is a true demand signal versus what is a quote-unquote artificial demand signal? So how do you think about that topic, Ryan?
I appreciate that you called it multifaceted. I think that, what we have is a good problem to have, which again is that American agriculture is highly productive. And ultimately we need markets and uses that find homes for that. But when I at least look at, the biofuels industry, it's still relatively new. It's not new. It's not shiny, new car smell new, but it is still new. And, there's innovation and evolution happening in that to bring it into, parity with synthetic, fossil, sources. And so you do have to, buoy that to some extent. You do have to support that in some extent as you, move something into being an accepted, broad scale use, because change is hard. And so, at the end of the day, we can call it an artificial demand signal, or we can, call it, market support. We can, call it driving, incentivizing. We can call it incentivizing a decision that ultimately has some positive outcomes, for the economy at large, because we do have a surplus. We do have the blessing of a surplus of some of these commodities. And so to be able to use those as a lever to create energy independence, to create a bountiful and safe food supply, to, be able to feed animals, et cetera, I think are positives out of the situation that we can definitely pull from. But as you said, playing the S&D game is definitely complex and difficult at times.
Yeah, and I take your point. I think that's a very fair point too, that if we allowed the market to create and respond to its own signals, it may not in the near term create the signals that factor in the value of energy independence. Sustainably reliable food abundance, caloric surplus. And so this is always an area of discomfort for me. So I appreciate these discussions, because I look at it and say, man, this feels like policies that we're playing. We're picking winners and losers. We're supporting this industry, perhaps to the detriment of that industry, or what's the role of government? Why is government involved here, et cetera? But when you do pan back and you look at the other sort of societal objectives, then I do think the nuance becomes uncomfortable and becomes a little more ambiguous. But it's an important input, I guess. Something I just thought about here: if we go back to the RVO and we think about the American agricultural sector's ability to produce, X billion gallons of renewable fuels, for example, or X million bushels of soybeans in their raw form, whatever it might be. Any sense of, by removing the ability to apply incentives to Chinese UCO or Brazilian tallow, how meaningful of a move is that alone into bringing into balance our production capacity, our ability to produce with our capacity for processing? Because again, I'm jumping around here, but that got a lot of press, and a lot of folks are really excited about that, right? We can rely on domestic feedstocks, but was imported UCO and tallow a meaningful percentage of biofuel production up until the end of 2024? What are we talking about? 5%, 15%, 50%? Where are we at?
Billions of gallons of UCO were coming in, and in some cases, Brazilian tallow, as you also mentioned, because of the cost disparities, it was a significant part of the biofuels production. And so what we are doing again is creating or leveling, that playing field where there is a value proposition that can be captured by keeping that as a domestic feedstock source instead of importing it in.
So that's not signaling or leveraging people's desire to support the American farmer and creating a boogeyman in the abstract and saying, well, we import this UCO, but then ultimately the UCO imports are not that big of a deal, and we sort of inflate the threat. It was a significant amount coming in, and by stripping away the incentives from that importation, it actually does have a meaningful felt impact in American ag. Is that true?
Yes, it will matter. It's why it has been so much a part of the discussion as we have sought to set these new RVOs and create this tax policy in 45Z for there to be some kind of domestic preference and or domestic incentive, both again to stem that significant flow and also with all of the other impacts that are disturbing soybean and other commodity movement, creating an opportunity to have a increased demand somewhere in somewhere in the matrix, so to speak.
And we will still process UCO in the United States. This will not shut off the importation of that as a feedstock. Folks still presumably would import some proportion of that as part of their mix, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. It's why I triggered on the exclusion word that you used earlier, because it absolutely doesn't block, that as it will still be imported. It's just about, as I said, leveling the playing field and creating an opportunity for American commodity to come closer to first or to come first.
Okay. As we get closer to the end of our time here, and I should say to our listeners, Ryan actually dialed in from a research center in the southeast or in the mid-south of the United States. So dedication, despite all the things that are happening in DC behind the scenes that are so material to the industry, and despite the fact that he's on the road, still chose to take the time to spend with those days. So thanks again, Ryan, for that. Let's talk for just a moment before we close out about where things stand relative to trade. And the reason I want to go here is, obviously, if we are making changes that don't disadvantage the importation of feedstocks like used cooking oil, but clearly just level the playing field, right? They trade basis their own cost in the market, not their cost competitiveness in the market plus an incentive earned. That's part of our trade relationship with China. But panning back to soybeans writ large, where do things stand today? What are you seeing? We're in this 90-day reprieve where we've sort of backed off some of the higher levels of tariffs with China. They've reciprocated by reducing tariffs in kind. But where are things at today? Where do you see them shaking out? And do you see any long tail risk to our reputation as a reliable supplier of beans to the world because of this, the turbulent period we've gone through here recently?
I think you can ultimately look back to the last time that we ultimately ended up in I'll use the dramatic word tariff war, but where we did end up in a disagreement over tariffs, and we saw significant impact to the global trade system for our commodities. And a lot of that has not come back. And at the end of the day, whether, it's, you can point at politics, you can point at business practice. People want reliable suppliers. They want to know that you can get a commodity from point A to point B, that it's of consistent quality, and that it is a quote unquote, fair or at least known price. And in this environment, those things fluctuate. And in some cases, they fluctuated daily, they fluctuated weekly. And that creates a scenario where the buying decision is impacted. And once you find a new supplier, think about your own home. If you're going to buy Energizer batteries and there's no Energizer batteries, and you switch to Rayovac and Rayovac gets the job done, you may not switch back to Energizer when they show up on the shelves again. Your need's been met. That brand, or in this case, that supplier's had an opportunity to demonstrate their quality, their assuredness of delivery. And, those contracts sometimes are multi-year. There's all sorts of factors that I won't, bore the listeners with. But at the end of the day, once that business is lost, it takes you twice as much effort to get it back. And we're still in that process of the twice as much effort to get some of these commodity trade markets back. And we have more fluctuation and more doubt in who we are as a consistent supplier to the market.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, because I don't think the elasticity of the relationship, it's not going to snap back as tight and firm as it was before. Once you normalize, once you've created the discomfort, you created the stress, you created the stretch, if you will, in a supplier-supplyee type relationship. And I think about the 2018 sort of trade war under Trump 1.0. And without levying any sort of judgment on whether or not that was the right thing to do or not, we were very aggressive in our trade negotiations, and China placed a 25% retaliatory tariff on U.S. soybeans. And as part of that, of course, soybean exports didn't go to zero. I don't think the world's set up for anyone to wean themselves off U.S. soybeans, at least not the Chinese, and certainly not overnight. But Chinese buyers switched to Brazilian soybeans. And in that next 5-month period, U.S. soybean prices declined by about 18% relative to Brazilian prices. Now, that was a 5-month period, but my understanding is we haven't even really ever gotten all that demand back from Brazil. At the same time, we see a continued build out of Brazilian production infrastructure, distribution, and export. So over time, I fear that these episodic, tough negotiations, whether they're right or wrong, justified or not, properly executed or not, everyone's going to have their own opinion. They do have some long tail consequences that could be export demand destruction. At the same time, we've had a number of guests on that have taken taken a position that they're maybe less convinced on how quickly Brazil could replace the U.S. as the supplier of soybeans to the world because of just the scale of our production and our efficiency at export, et cetera. So, I mean, when you look at this, how would you properly weight the risk of near-term trade disruptions forfeiting future ability to export beans to China, for example, or to Japan or to other major markets? Is this a marginal impact, or do you think over time it becomes material and actually leads to other countries taking over the U.S.'s sort of pole position as the number one exporter of beans to the world?
Well, there's been some arguments that say that Brazil is outproducing us today, just in bushels. The limitations being the quality, the limitations being the infrastructure and the ability for them to move those actually to port in order for them to reach other markets. But even that notwithstanding, every time you create these ripples or these fluctuations, you leave an opening for those limitations to be removed or for them to be mediated. So there's been significant investment in Brazil on their infrastructure, both road and rail, to move soybeans to port. There's been significant investment in the agronomic skills to mitigate some of the disease and environmental impacts that are influencing their quality. And so every time you leave an opening for a competitor, they tend to improve, and the investment that comes from those ripples. So those time periods where they are getting greater demand for their commodity, they invest in continuing to, again, improve their competitive position. And so, we say a lot, and I, appreciate as well, it's not a judgment call one way or another. I think all of us want increased American energy dominance. Everyone, wants to be healthy. Everyone wants more domestic manufacturing. All of these are phenomenal aspirations, but you have to think about the levers that you're pulling and what the long-term consequences, and in some cases, the short-term consequences of those actions are. And I think in this case, we're going to continue to see challenges to our dominance as a supplier and as the production leader because we're creating this opportunity for openings amongst our competitors.
Yeah, well said. Well said. And so, I mean, these limitations that folks have on the road to rail infrastructure that allows interior production to ultimately be distributed to ports for export, those constraints don't necessarily exist in perpetuity, right? Those things they'll eventually compete those constraints away. Brazil may in fact be outproducing the U.S. in terms of total volume produced of soybeans. If you start to look at that through the lens of yield per acre, their agronomic efficiency might be significantly lower. We're probably producing nearly the same number of beans on less acreage, but again, their yields won't be held steady in perpetuity either. And so they will continue to compete, particularly when provided the opportunity to capture market share. And so I certainly hope that the powers that be consider these long tail consequences or risks that are born from near term sort of levers that are pulled. Ryan, we could go on and on. I know you've got a lot going on. So let me just close by again saying thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us today. And
it's a pleasure.
And hopefully it's gonna be a lot of fun to play the game of seeing how much of this is still accurate by the time we publish the episode because things change so fast. For folks that want to follow the National Oilseed Processors Association and see what you all are up to, where's the best place for them to find out more?
So they're welcome to go to our website. That's www.nopa.org. We have an active LinkedIn presence, and we look forward to engaging with anyone who wants to have a conversation about how we push America forward and support oilseed producers and growers and the American economy.
Very good. Very good. Well, thank you. We'll make sure we have all of that in the show notes so listeners can quickly find you guys and follow and pay attention. And so again, thank you, Ryan. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning into today's episode of the Pacesetter Pod. A very quick reminder to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already. And if you found value in today's conversation, the single best thing you can do is share this with somebody else that you think would also find value in it. Not whether or not you agree with it, but whether or not it helps enhance and enrich your thinking and help look at these complex issues from multiple angles. I think that's what we need to be doing today to make sure we're bringing the best thinking and the best decision making when it comes to strategy and execution in our agribusinesses. And so thanks again for joining us, and I look forward to having you right here again the next time on the Pacesetter Pod.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.